Hey everyone, I made these two for planning your landing pattern, and I think it can be quite useful, and I'm excited to share it with you here. In this video I'll quickly show what it does, and then I'll go into some details on how to use it effectively and how to set it up. The basic idea and the way that it's different from other tools that I've seen out there is that it uses one of your flight side tracks when planning instead of, assuming just a few points in the pattern. As a disclaimer, it's just a tool. Please don't trust it blindly and use common sense when using it. So let's get into it. What you see here is one of my fly side tracks from earlier this year in Z Hills, and it's loaded in the app. You can see it on the map. This is pretty much what you see in Flight Side Viewer, except it's been trimmed so that it only contains the portion from my pattern entry down to my plane out point, more or less. So I know that I captured this sample in very light winds. So if I'm planning my pattern for the day, I might use that as a starting point and then adjust for the winds. If I wanted to fly that same pattern, the same altitudes and so on, but run the distance course, normally I would have to sort of start from scratch and measure it and build it up. But with this tool, I can just adjust the positioning. I can rotate it and offset it. So work with the data from FlySide directly. So I can just adjust the offset to more or less the correct place. And now I see more or less where my pattern and light winds is, and I can look for my ground references and so on. Another thing I can do is I can just move this whole thing to a different drop zone. Say if I wanted this in Eloy, I can just move it here. Interface is a bit quirky, and that's work in progress. So I can just move it to Skydive, Arizona. It's the same pattern, assuming light winds, so I can look for my ground references. So where this gets more interesting is if I want to model the effects of the wind, and I can do so under this wind menu here. So as an example, let's add some wind, some tailwind. So I'm going to add 10 knots of tailwind, and now I see two different plots. In red is the original pattern that hasn't been changed in any way, and green is the same pattern except I've tried to add to account for 10 knots of wind from the east. And I think it's important to understand exactly how this works. So this last point in my track, I'm going to maintain the exact same position. And then for each subsequent point, I'm going to offset it relative to the previous one based on what this wind is set up. So you see in this case, every single point is offset east. And you see how, for example, this point here is offset by, I don't know, 40 feet, while my pattern entry point is offset much more. And that because this entry point has been affected by the wind for the entire duration. So if I wanted to change the wind direction, that's easy, and it's quite interesting to just play with that and see how the shape of the ground track changes in different wind conditions. So if I remove the wind, you see it's a pretty clear how the turn radius decreases, and then there's a snap, and then I go more or less straight. But if I add some wind, that shape is going to change dramatically depending on the direction of the wind. So I can just do this. So it's very easy to see how this sort of shape is normal if you have a tailwind, and this sort of shape is normal if you have a headwind. So that's just a co-observation. Another thing you can notice is how I've annotated a few of the points here. So my turn to base, my initiation point, and my snap point. And if I just change the wind, at least in this constant wind, you can see how each of those points makes a little circle around the point in no wind. And that circle is just larger the earlier in the pattern I am. So these are just some cool things you can do. If I wanted to use the current wind conditions from winds aloft, I can just do this here. And you see pretty heavy winds in the hills right now. So this takes into account winds at different altitudes. I just ignore wind shear. So when the points cross that threshold, I just assume that the wind instantaneously affects us with the new value. That's not entirely realistic, but we make that assumption anyway, and if there's significant wind shear, we're not jumping anyway, so it should be pretty reasonable. If you wanted to adjust some of these, you can click unlock and then say, if you observe that the ground wind is much lower, you can account for it this way. So how do you use this tool yourself? What I'm working with right now is my own sample, but you really want to use your own because, well, you're flying a different canopy, you're flying your pattern in a different way, you're flying your turn in a different way, everything is different. And you can do so by loading a custom track. You can do this here. I have a few samples to play with. This is not limited to swooping in any way. You can totally use it for patterns with a straight in approach. Here's one example that I have. I don't really have any good ones, but. And if you wanted to, if the full ground track was too much, you could edit the file to just contain a few points. The timestamps are important because that gives us the descent rate, so that the wind is accounted properly. But if you can reduce it to something like this, and then it's much easier to say add wind from and we see a sort of normal looking pattern with headwind. This is automatically a drifting pattern. Changing to a crabbing pattern would not be simple. Anyway, the way to load your own track would be you just select the fly side file here. And now show you an example and show you why it doesn't work well to just import it this way. It has a lot of extra data. So my whole plane ride and my whole descent is here, plus after I walked off the course, the fly side was still on. So I want to trim all this. You could use auto trim here, that's experimental, and it's gonna select one point here somewhere and an entry at 2,500 feet. But I advise to not use this feature and to instead do it manually, because then you'll be sure where this point is selected, and I think that's pretty important for planning. So how do you trim it manually? It's pretty simple. I'm just going to show you an example. So I'm going to open that same file in FlySide Viewer. And first I'm going to find the point where I want my pattern to start. I'm just going to use a point here somewhere at 2,300 feet-ish. So I'm going to look at the timestamp, where it says 001916, and I'm going to remember that. So I'm just going to open this file in a plain text editor, and then I'm going to look for that timestamp. 001919 is what I'm looking for. When I find it, I'm going to select all the lines from here to the beginning of the file. That would be my plain write and descent, and remove them. Then I'm going to find the final point. I like to find the point where I'm just planing out. This way I can set it at the gates. And I'm going to look for the elevation here. I like this one at 9 feet. So the timestamp is 002003-500. I'm going to find this here. 2003-500. And I'm going to remove everything below. I'm going to make sure there's no empty lines or things like that. And then I'm just going to save the file. Then I'm going to go back to the sample here. Then when I load the trim file, it's trimmed properly. Could have trimmed that shorter, and that's not a good pattern, but that's just an example. If I wanted to save this for reuse, I can give it a name here. And then it shows up in this menu, so I can reference it quickly. Note that this is saved in the browser, so if you go on a different device, you're not going to have them here. So you should still be organizing your files on your own. I think the last thing to mention is when you change the position, you can move it to one of these locations that I've pre-built. Here's Houston. But if you wanted to add your own, you can do it under custom locations here. You just need to look up the longitude and latitude of your drop zone and just enter a name. You know, something like this. I have no idea where this is going to add me, but and then it's in the list and I can move to it easily. That's not an easy spot. Anyway, that's how you can use the tool. It's an open source tool. The code is here on GitHub. It's licensed under Apache. There's a lot of work on the interface that I want to do. If you want to contribute or just see how this works, go ahead. There's some documentation on how to use it, but I think this video is going to be a better reference. The code is not complex at all, so if you wanted to see how it works, you can go ahead and browse. Here's how points are moved, for example. I think that about wraps it up. If you have any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to talk about this. Use GitHub or email or Facebook or whatever. I'll make sure to include links to this and the description of the video, and I hope you found this useful.